Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. On October 7th, the United States imposed a sweeping list of restrictions on the Chinese tech industry. To discuss these sweeping list of restrictions and the ongoing tech war with China, I have with me Pranay Kotasthane. Hi, Pranay.
Hi, Pranav. Good to be here.
Yeah, Pranay, let's straight up jump into what's going on. The Bureau of Industries of the United States issued two sets of documents that details the new rules of tech war, if we can call it that. The first one is about the list of items that are under export controls, and the second one is list of companies in the unverified list and how these companies must be treated by US regulators. I want to jump into the shorter document, which is the list of unverified companies, which is about 25 pages long. What does this document tell us? It's a list of companies. What does unverified mean? And what is the restrictions imposed on these companies or the people who are working in these companies?
Yeah. So, hi, Pranav. So, first of all, it's Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS. So, it is a part of the Commerce Department. And I think if you go to those regulations that both of us have tried to do, first of all, they are way, way complicated. Once you go into that, you will get lost into a lot of details. So, what I wanted to do is just zoom out and highlight the most important parts, otherwise it's very, very intricately curated and formed. So as you rightly said, there are two rules. One rule is called the revisions to the unverified list, etc. So there are two sets of things that they have done there. One, they are modifying the criteria under which an entity gets added to something called the entity list, right? Whereas once you are in the entity list, a whole lot of restrictions apply to people to supplying equipments to that particular company, right? So now what they have said is that before entity list, there's something called the unverified list, UVL. So what they have said is that there are certain Chinese companies, 31 of them, which have been added to this UVL list. And what it means is that the US government is saying they are not confident of the end use of these particular products that the company makes. So what they are saying is that these companies are now marked as unverified list. Now, provided that the Chinese government and the companies give enough proof that the work that they are doing do not fall under the restricted end use category products like say military, or they are not used for terrorism purposes, etc. Provided that these things don't happen, these entities can graduate, so to say, to the entity list. So this is like, you can think of it at a meta level as a warning sign for some of those companies. And one of the famous memory making companies called YMTC, Yangtze Memory Technologies Co Limited, is a part of this UVL list. It's a very big player in China on the memory chips scene. So that's why it's made a lot of news. Okay, so that's the bigger picture of this. There's a second rule, right? The second rule is the one which runs into how many pages?
About 115 to 120 pages, which is the second document that tells you exactly what are the items that are restricted by the export controls imposed.
Yeah. So we've tried to go through that, and there are several self-referential things in the document. So I'm sure there are many people in the US who know this better. But what we could understand, again, going from a very broad perspective, the idea there is that advanced computing equipment, so advanced computing chips, including AI chips, they will be restricted. So they are under control, so to say. So any US company or any company in the world which uses US equipment to make those kinds of chips, if they are going to supply to a Chinese buyer, then these restrictions apply. And what are the restrictions? Basically, there are a whole lot of, you need to get a license for supplying to this, and there are conditions under which licenses can be obtained, can be denied, etc. So now essentially, if there's anything that is to do with advanced computing, supercomputing, AI chips, it will be difficult for Chinese companies to access it. And secondly, it's not just the chips that have been restricted. There are a whole lot of restrictions on the exact processes that go into making a less than 14 nanometer logic chip, more than 128 layer memory chip. So So the way you can think of it is anything which is advanced and has dual use. So maybe could be used to make more precision guided missiles, etc. But can also be used for a whole lot of commercial purposes. Those things will come under licensed category. Okay. So this is sort of one way to look at it. The way I put it in, even in more simpler terms, because it is very confusing, the way I put it is that this is a clear sign of decoupling in the high-tech sector. Okay. So reason I say this is that there are two broad things which have happened. Okay. One, that these kind of controls are increasing both the breadth and the depth of controls. What do I mean by that, right? So if you take a combination of what's happened in two rules, in terms of breadth, what has happened is that controls have expanded to many more Chinese companies, like we discussed, 31 more companies, also to universities and more sectors than ever before. So any university which is doing cutting edge work on this and might have military connections, etc., that gets controlled, right? Supplies to them. So as I said, for instance, Chinese entities cannot access supercomputers or chips that go into them, including AI chips. And another target is semiconductor manufacturing equipment that can be used to produce chips that go into weapons or into products that also enable human right abuses. So even that is sort of controlled. And by depth, I mean that the existing controls have become even more restrictive than before. So it's not as if these controls didn't exist in the past. Some controls existed. But what used to happen is that it was very easy to get export licenses. So there are a whole lot of companies, even the Trump administration had one version of these, but it was easy to get export licenses. So they weren't effective in that sense. So what current rules have done is that they make it very difficult for companies to obtain license. So by default, there's a presumption on denial on certain categories. Okay. So it will be very difficult for companies to get licenses for certain categories, right? So that's one big thing.
So listen, because you gave us a broad picture, some of the more specifics, especially in the companies in the unverified list. What I was able to understand was, first, because the Chinese government does not allow the US government auditors and inspectors to actually look at the end use of the products that are being made, which is the reason why these companies are going in the unverified list. But to what extent can the US government actually verify the end use without actually going and auditing these companies and getting their inventory list and so on? Is there a possibility that these are more political, or is it genuinely that they cannot verify certain aspects of where the end item is actually going?
I mean, I think everything is political here. So there's no question about that. So they have put sort of the monkey on CCP's back. So now it is for the Chinese government and the companies to prove that they are not guilty of the end users. So that's what it is. So it's like you can think of it as a warning shot, right? Like they're saying, we think this is suspect. Now you prove to us that you don't meet these end use criteria. Okay, so that's how you would understand. But broadly, this is essentially a geopolitical act. And in fact, if you have seen the long document, one of the new categories which have been added as a rationale for these restrictions is something called the RS category, which is regional stability. So they are saying that anything which goes against national security or foreign policy interests of the US, which is very broad, that can be controlled, right? So this follows from Jake Sullivan's speech, if you would have noticed that a few days ago, where he said that they have identified a few critical technologies, 3, right? I think supply chain, computing, advanced computing, clean tech, and biotech. So he made these 3 are the technologies in which he said it's not just enough to be ahead of China, but to take the lead as far as possible. So this is a very big change in approach. They are not saying that we just have to be one step ahead of China, but we need to actively widen the gap. And actively widen the gap means that they also want to sort of deny access to China to certain technologies. And on semiconductors, it works out well for US because if you look at China's tech stack, this is a weak link. They don't have EDA tool makers. The design is okay, some firms are there, but not the best ones are still in the US. Advanced manufacturing capability, again, they are dependent on Taiwan, etc. So there is a weak link which the US is trying to exploit. So obviously it is a lot about geopolitics.
Yeah. And the other thing you said that it's not just one step, it goes several leaps ahead. One of the things I also, while reading the document, understood was that they're also restricting the knowledge transfer. That is, they're making sure that people are not associated with institutions that might have dual use. So one of the concerns about the US government for a very long time, and they're prosecuting some professors also of alleged spying because they were participating in projects with universities that might have connections with the PLA. So they've also tried to close the door on that end, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So there is a significant section in that big document on, US persons aiding to build advanced computing capabilities in China, or aiding their semiconductor industry to gain certain kinds of capabilities and end uses which might be harmful to national security interests of the US. So yes, there are lots of recession. That's why I say this is the moment we can say there's decoupling happening in the high-tech sector. I don't know whether decoupling overall will happen, because US-USSR equation is very different from the US-China equation. In the latter case, there's a lot of economic intertwining, etc. But in the high-tech sector, so wherever there is this notion that some things are very strategic, the way I put it is, last 30 years, semiconductors, if you put all industries on a spectrum, where the spectrum measures state's strategicness towards a particular item.
Okay.
Probably automobiles and defense production will be on opposite ends of this spectrum, right? Near opposite.
Yeah.
So automobiles are important from an economic job generation point of view, but they are not strategic in any way. But defense production is.
Yeah.
So semiconductors for the last 30 years were lying more towards the automobile side. But with this move and what has happened over the last 2-3 years, it is very clear that now semiconductors are being perceived in a very quote unquote strategic lens. So like the state is very concerned about what goes into their defense production equipment, how are they sourced and all that, right? Those kinds of things will also apply to the semiconductor supply chain. So this is a new thing. So that's why I say decoupling has happened, and there are various layers of decoupling. One layer of decoupling is equipment. One layer of decoupling is human resource transfer. So talent transfer. So that's what they are trying to restrict, talent flow as well. And as I said, it's also on universities. Some of the universities this is the government's attempt to, the US government is trying to have very fine-tuned controls on advanced computing, with the assumption that probably the controls on trailing edge nodes, the older tech, will continue, the trade will continue. But we know that there will be friction introduced. More people will be circumspect about moving to China, more whatever, right? Transfer of capital, equipment, goods, services, talent, all that will have significant friction now.
And Pranay, we're talking about high tech here, and the objective of these restrictions are to ensure that China's ability to produce high-tech military capabilities and supercomputers is restricted. I understand the supercomputers part because some of the world's fastest supercomputers, like the Summit, which was built by NVIDIA, is used to simulate nuclear explosions and build warheads, right? It's in the Lawrence Livermore labs. And China is also using similar equipment to improve its warhead design. But you also mentioned 40 nanometer restrictions on equipment to make 40 nanometer chips. But as far as I can understand, 40 nanometer chips are actually kind of old. I've heard that they're about 7 to 8 years old, and the latest is about 8 nanometer chips.
No, we have 5 nanometer chips under production, and already 3 nanometer chips are being tested. So yeah.
So are these really going to constrain China's military capabilities? Because in general, you don't require extremely high precision. Some of our smartphones have, although by design they're like that, you don't require, you require high power chips and definitely more efficient chips for military equipment, but definitely not sort of high tech chips in that sense.
Yeah.
So what's the objective? Will it really have a dent on China's military capabilities?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in 2 ways. One, the restrictions on semiconductor manufacturing equipment can go even further than on 16, 14 nanometer chips. That depends on the end use. Okay. So the way to look at these controls is like, look at a Venn diagram with several circles. And the idea is, if you're not caught in one restriction, you will be caught in another circle. So that's the way it is. At the intersection of this, they hope to control a lot of things that go into the military tech. So if the end use is military, then semiconductor manufacturing equipment, some of the older manufacturing equipment, because there is, for example, it's not as if you can have a manufacturing equipment which only goes for 128 layers or more for memory, but there is a completely different set of manufacturing equipment which goes for 128 layers or less. right? There will be commonalities. So if you are restricting something which goes for 128 or more, you're also going to end up restricting 128 or less, so that is what is going to happen even with these restrictions. So those will be controlled by the end use restrictions category, right? So if they have enough evidence that things are going on the military side, even the trailing edge nodes, some of them might get captured. At least the manufacturing equipment will be difficult to obtain for the Chinese companies. That's one part of the answer. The other part that you said is, so for military, you might not require always 14 nanometer and below. But what is happening is, as I see it, the aim is not just military control. The aim is clearly to bottleneck China's progress in advanced computing in general.
And especially artificial intelligence, because I see AI chips mentioned a lot.
Yeah. So one of the parts of that is AI chips. So AI chips, obviously there will be many commercial users, etc. So even in AI chips, there are training chips and inference chips. Training chips are ones which are 5 nanometer, etc., which are at the cutting edge. Inference chips can be made at trailing edge nodes, So the restriction is on the training chips, which currently NVIDIA and only a couple of other GPUs are able to do. So there, the clear restriction is it will also hurt the commercial enterprise, not just the military enterprise.
Okay. And so the next natural question is, if China is constrained by so many regulations, is their domestic industry well built, or does it have the capacity to catch up? And what are there any companies that are replicating things that are already being done in countries like Taiwan and Japan and South Korea?
Yeah, so there are many companies within China all this started with China itself saying that they want to do things on their own, they want to decouple from the US. So we should be very clear, these are in response to what China started. Right?
And US is basically, you can also say that US is fulfilling China's wishes.
Yeah, so that is one way. But what I would say is that it will be very difficult for China to catch up in the short term. And the options for China now in this sector probably are one, industrial espionage of some sort to get talent or to get know-how from other places. Also targeted poaching in a sense from players like TSMC, etc. Or they'll have to do some domestic reinventing of the wheel, right? So they'll have to figure out how, say, you have to do extreme ultraviolet lithography, which currently only ASML has that tech. So they'll have to figure out how to do this at home. Now, all this China could have done, but now with access to the international ecosystem cutoff, it will be much more difficult. So I don't, it's not as if they won't be able to do. None of this is something that we can, there were restrictions on India's space sector as well, but we were able to put something, right? But when things are of a commercial nature, when the real way you make money is by efficiency gains, etc., you require the talent of the planet in this sector, right? There's a reason why the semiconductor supply chain is spread all across the world, right? So now once you have cut off that access, it will be much more difficult and much more costly. So you can think of it as the opportunity cost for China to do anything in the semiconductor sector has increased immensely. That doesn't mean they can't do it, but it will take more time. It will, and definitely like over the next few years, I think US will still be able to maintain the edge over China in this sector.
Okay, that's because what you once said, you brought up espionage and then you brought up constraints on India's space program. Both of these are, and the actions that have been taken by the US itself, it seems like it's sort of a 21st century version of what was being done as non-proliferation technology sanctions. You were not given access to supercomputers, your satellite technology was severely restricted, your rocket technology was severely restricted. And a lot of times, countries would really endure the trouble of diverting massive amounts of resources from development to just nuclear, as we see North Korea, right? North Korea is severely restricted by technology, but still they're able to do a lot of things. And even India, for some time, we had restrictions, but we were able to get through. So would it be China because one, we know that a lot of Chinese students themselves, the number has never decreased. There's still a massive number of Chinese students going to the US. What do you think that China would do in the near and midterm to sort of overcome these constraints, to frame it as a 21st century model of non-proliferation?
No, so as I said, first, there is a key difference here as of now. At least two differences I see from the old one. So first of all, those controls were multilateral, right? It was a multilateral export control regime on whether it is on nuclear or space. Currently, these are unilateral controls by US, right? So there's a Wassenaar agreement update meeting which will happen soon. So if there is an agreement on some of these things, it might expand to multilateral. But right now, these are US unilateral controls. US is only saying that if you are using any company in the world, if you are using our technology to give something to China for so and so reasons or end users, this gets controlled. But some countries can still go ahead which are not using US made equipment, right? So that can still happen. So there is one sort of a difference. The other big difference is that when you talk of space or nuclear in 1960s, 70s, the primary buyer were only government entities of other countries, right? Here, the success of any semiconductor enterprise will depend on commercial use cases finally. Like you can't just make, a fab can't just make chips in mass quantities for the army because there are not enough tanks or precision guided munitions that you will make to make at the cutting edge and to recoup the money that you go, like, I mean, you're going to put $12 billion for one 5 nanometer fab. To recoup that money, you need massive amount of buyers for that, and which will be only there in commercial sector. So these are, I think, two key differences. Now coming to how will China try to overcome, like I said, there will be, I see attempts of industrial espionage, targeted poaching, some amount of domestic innovation going up. I think one interesting outlier would be China might take a completely different path and approach technologies which are not controlled. Maybe do more things like virtualization, where you use software to do some of the things that the hardware cutting edge can do. So you use older hardware but try to do something on the software. Or there can be other technologies as well, like silicon carbide, SiC is being talked about a lot. That's alternate to CMOS fabs. So new fab technologies, gallium nitride, etc. So things which are not under control of this, there might be a lot of effort to get those up to production grade.
Yeah, but on the company side, companies are the key here. How difficult is it to sort of flush out these companies that are, let's say, they're companies set up exclusively to circumvent these regulations? In the non-proliferation side, I can remember one fun case I can remember is Iran tried to set up a shell company in a different country for buying pressure inducer for pressure sensors for their rockets, but they were ultimately caught, right? So is it easier, just a noob question, is it easier to catch these companies, trace their origins to China?
Yeah, no, I'm sure that will be tried. And actually, this is easier you can easily source some chips for military purposes and all, right? Like, I mean, if you want some key chips, it's not as if it will occupy a huge amount of space. If your use case is just military, right? Yeah. But for the commercial players, I mean, some of the know-how that is required in all this is tough to obtain, right? Even like you see, it's not as if China cannot make 5 nanometer chips today. It can make using old tech. It is called DUV instead of extreme ultraviolet lithography, but the yield will be very low. So basically, you will make a whole lot of chips, 50-60% will not work, will fail. Only 40% will work. Whereas if you use EUV, you will have much higher efficiency. You will not waste so much. They will do that. So obviously, it will be much costly. Their products will be costlier. The money that they are putting will be much higher in it. So economically, these things will not be remunerative for them. A classic case that you can look at is Huawei's thing, right? So these restrictions were first applied on Huawei as a company. And what we see is Huawei is able to do some things domestically, but their international market has completely flattened because of the restrictions. So at least in the short term, the lesson that the US has taken away is that these kinds of controls can constrain certain entities.
Okay, yeah. And then finally, let's move on to a small portion of what the US is doing to ensure that its supply chains are secure. Because most of the fabrication, we know a company like TSMC is the backbone of the chip manufacturing in the world. So the question is, obviously, China's threats to Taiwan are getting more and more. They seem to be getting more and more credible. China is taking riskier steps. They had the exercise when Nancy Pelosi visited. They had a series of exercises that raised concerns. So what is the US doing to ensure that its supply chains are secure from sudden shocks in the international system? Yeah,
so that's why there are alliances being talked about. There's a Chip 4 alliance. There are things on the Quad which were happening, but we don't know what has happened after the initial supply chain security initiative that was started. So the idea is plurilateralism is one way to sort of overcome a big player like China. So if you want to create a void of China size, the only way to fill it is through collaboration with other players. So that is one option. The other thing is, Taiwan, a lot of US and in Europe, they are inviting TSMC to set up bases there, right? So maybe over time, the hope is that there will be also capabilities outside Taiwan, which will there. And I think, see, the key element in this, like I was saying, is efficiency, right?
Okay.
How do you go from, think of it as someone making food, right? Like what are the exact amount of ingredients to put? What is the recipe? Those are all finally questions of human talent. So, and TSMC has been able to build it over 20, 30 years. And the idea is that if China were to take over Taiwan for other reasons, I don't think it will be for semiconductors, because even if they take over Taiwan, that TSMC will require extensive international collaboration, which won't happen when it is controlled by Taiwan, by China, right? So the key thing is Taiwanese talent, the know-how, the expertise, which I'm sure they must be thinking of, if such an event happens, how that talent can be moved to other places so that things can be started off quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Pranay. A lot of other questions pop up, but we're running short of time. Like, for example, questions about whether these companies really have ties to the PLA and so on, but we'll save that for some other day. Thank you once again for joining us, and thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
Thanks, Pranav. Bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.